Thank you, Mr. President. I rise this afternoon to speak on S-178, the Justice for Victims of Trafficking Act, and the Toomey Mansion Amendment number 291 to that bill. First of all, I want to thank Senator Cornyn for bringing this bill to the Senate floor. It's a bipartisan bill. It's an extremely important bill, and it's been awfully frustrating that we can't even get onto this bill. Especially hard to understand is the fact that this is a bipartisan bill, had 10 Democratic co-sponsors, another 3 Democrats who voted for it in the Senate Judiciary Committee. This shouldn't even be controversial. And it's particularly disturbing because when you think about what we're trying to address with this bill, with Senator Cornyn's bill, it's awfully important. I mean, what could be more despicable than what we're trying to go after here? Trafficking in human beings. This is a form of modern-day slavery is what it is. And some of the most despicable people in the world take the most vulnerable people in our society and they turn them into essentially slaves in the sex industry. I mean, it's as appalling as that. It happens, and it happens in every state. And what this bill does is it provides more tools for law enforcement to better be able to crack down on this appalling practice. And it provides harsher penalties, as well it should. And it provides more resources for the folks who do really, really important work helping the victims to heal. And that is a very long, very difficult, very painful process. It's unimaginable what some of these folks go through, children forced into slavery, brutalized, beaten, raped. It's a dehumanizing, atrocious situation. We have a bill here that's bipartisan that would actually do something constructive about it, and our Democratic colleagues will not allow us to even begin the debate, much less actually move on and process amendments. Now, I understand, Mr. President, there's a provision in the bill that they don't like. I get that. But we have offered repeatedly that they will be allowed to offer any amendment they like. They can offer an amendment to strike the language to which they object, and that's the way the Senate is supposed to work. You put a bill on the floor. If somebody doesn't like something that's in it, you try to change it. It's pretty basic. It's pretty fundamental, and that's what we ought to be doing. But we haven't been able to persuade enough of our Democratic colleagues to allow us to proceed to this bill yet. I hope we will soon. And one of the reasons I hope so goes beyond the substance of this bill, and that is the amendment that Senator Manchin and I will introduce as soon as we're able to do that. This is an amendment. It will allow us to amend the underlying trafficking bill with a bill that Senator Manchin and I have introduced. It's designed to protect kids from sexual abuse. It's amendment number 291, and it's based on a bill that we have that's called the Protecting Students from Sexual and Violent Predators Act. And the goal is just to protect kids from pedophiles in schools. That's what it comes down to. Overwhelming bipartisan support for our legislation, the bill that I introduced with Senator Manchin. It passed the House unanimously, and I rose last week to ask unanimous consent to bring this amendment up and make it pending so that we could debate and we could vote on it. And one of our friends from the other side of the aisle objected to that as well. So no progress on this yet, but I'm convinced that this isn't going to stand, right? I'm just convinced that enough Democratic senators are going to come to their senses, and they're going to join us in voting to get on this bill, and we're going to be able, at some point, to proceed with this and to proceed with the various amendments that I and others intend to offer. So I want to speak a little bit about my amendment because I think we're going to get to it. And as I mentioned, it's about protecting kids at school from violent and sexual predators. Now let me start with an observation that should go without say, but I'm going to say it anyway, and that is we all know the overwhelming majority of school employees, teachers and non-teachers alike, are very good and decent people, and it would never occur to them to abuse the children in their care. They're motivated by their desire to help these kids succeed in the various ways that they help guide these kids. And I'm completely convinced that the overwhelming majority of teachers and school employees, they don't want a pedophile anywhere near their school. They don't want them in the classroom next to them. They don't want them coaching their kid. They don't want them in any way involved, because most teachers have the good sense and the decency that that's the way they are. But the reality is, schools are, in fact, where the kids are. And the pedophiles know this too. And so we've got a problem, Mr. President. The problem is that some of these predators are finding ways into the schools. The data is very clear. Last year alone, 459 school employees, some teachers, some non-teachers, 459 adult school employees were arrested across America for sexual misconduct with the kids that they're supposed to be looking after. 459 that we knew enough about what they were doing and the prosecutors felt they had a strong enough case that they could actually go ahead and make the arrest. How many more are under investigation? How many more there are suspicions but no evidence with which to pursue a case? Probably a lot more. But we know for sure that there's 459 appalling cases. And so far this year, we're on track to have similar numbers. We're, 70-some days into the school year. Over 90 school employees have already been arrested this year across the country. So this is absolutely a real problem. Some of these predators are finding ways to slip through the cracks of the system that's meant to keep them out. And I want to do something about it. And Senator Manchin wants to do something about it. And so here's our suggestion. We've got a bill that does two simple things. It says to the states, if you're going to continue to collect the billions of dollars in federal funding that goes to primary and secondary education, then you got to do a proper background check. You got to make sure that you're not hiring pedophiles. So you got to check both the federal and the state databases to make sure that you're doing a thorough background check. And the second requirement is you can't permit anybody to engage in this appalling practice that is known as passing the trash. It's shocking that this could even exist, but it does, and I will tell you the story that actually inspired this legislation, which is a case in point in passing the trash. So the story begins with a teacher teaching in Delaware County, Pennsylvania. And this teacher was a pedophile. He was molesting boys who were supposed to be in his care. Now, the school district figured out what was going on. There was never enough evidence to actually prosecute, but they knew that something was very much wrong. And they decided, the school district decided, it'd be better if this teacher became someone else's problem. So, as appalling as it is, what they did is they wrote a letter of recommendation to recommend this teacher for another job, provided that he would leave. Well, he left, went across the state border into West Virginia, applied for, and in part on the strength of the letter of recommendation he had, he gets hired at a school in West Virginia. He works as a teacher. He resumes what these people do, abusing children, eventually becomes principal. And while principal of the school, he rapes and murders a 12-year-old boy named Jeremy Bell. That's what happened. So the practice of knowingly sending a letter of recommendation along with a monster like this, that's what's known as passing the trash. And the appalling thing, as appalling as that is, it happens often enough that it has its own name. As a matter of fact, just Friday I was out in Pittsburgh, and I was visiting what a wonderful group of people. It's the Pittsburgh Action Against Rape. Great group of professionals who do wonderful work, mostly helping victims cope with the aftermath of their assaults. One of the people I met there and heard from was the president of the board of directors. Her name is Beth Doherty, and she told her story. And her story began when she was 15 years old, and she was in the band at her school when the band instructor began to rape her. And when she came forward and told the authorities what was happening, the school promised the teacher that they wouldn't conduct any investigation if he would just quietly resign. And then the school wrote a glowing letter of recommendation for this guy, which he took with him, went to Florida, and helped to find a teaching job there. Now, fortunately, the prosecutors in the case in Pennsylvania, they felt confident that they had a strong enough case, and in time they were able to get him extradited from Florida, and they prosecuted him, and they locked him up, and he's in jail today where he belongs in my hope for the rest of his life. But the point of this is, as appalling as it is, as shocking it is, as it is to our conscience to hear that anyone would do this, I'm here to say it happens. It happens, and we need to do something about it for the sake of Jeremy Bell, for the sake of Beth Doherty, and who knows how many other children. So our legislation is meant to deal with this, to simply require that the states have a provision in their law that makes it illegal to knowingly recommend for hire someone who's attacking kids this way. This too, Mr. President, it strikes me as a bill that should not be controversial. Passed the House unanimously, but there are people who are trying to kill this bill. So we have some of our friends on the other side of the aisle, and outside organizations from the left have argued against this. And I want to quote from a letter that was sent to all of us explaining why a number of these groups are opposing my legislation. Here's a quote. This is what they say in their letter. They say, quote, individuals who've been convicted of crimes and have completed their sentences should not be unnecessarily subjected to additional punishments because of these convictions. Well, wait a minute. Let's think about the logic of that position. By that logic, an admitted, convicted child molester who serves a 10-year prison sentence for his crime should be able to walk out of the jail, walk down the street, apply for and get a job teaching elementary school kids. How ridiculous is that? It's completely ridiculous. You know, our kids shouldn't be involuntary members of a social experiment where we're trying to see which convicted child molesters are going to be recidivists. Frankly, most of them are. And I'm not willing to take the risk that our kids should be left alone with people like that. We have a national sex offender registry for a reason. It's because we recognize that these people pose a danger that extends past the time of their incarceration. Parents need to know about that, and that's why we have this national registry, and schools need to avoid the danger. Now, to be clear, Mr. President, I'm not suggesting that a convicted child molester can never work again anywhere, but I am saying they shouldn't work in a school. And I think that's completely reasonable. I'm shocked, frankly, that these organizations would come out against this common sense legislation. But the objection, in fairness, there's some objection that comes from our side of the aisle as well. I have a colleague who I have all the respect in the world for. The senior senator from Tennessee is a wonderful senator, and I agree with him on far more than I disagree. But I have to say I strongly disagree with his view of this particular bill. He has been here on the Senate floor, and he's been very upfront with me about his opposition to our bill. And the basis of his opposition to my bill is he believes that passing the legislation that Senator Manchin and I are proposing, requiring background checks and forbidding the passing of trash, he believes that that constitutes the equivalent of a national school board. It's an unreasonable infringement on schools. Well, I couldn't disagree more. Now, the idea of a national school board is a terrible idea. I'm no interest in that. And you will never hear me arguing that the federal government should impose on the states and the school districts things like appropriate class size, or whether or not you should teach geometry before algebra in middle school, or what grade should students read The Grapes of Wrath, any of those kinds of curriculum issues or testing issues. Those should be left to local school boards and states. But that's not what we're trying to do here. What I'm saying with my legislation with Senator Manchin is if a state takes billions and billions of federal tax dollars each year, then you can't use that money to pay the salaries of a convicted child abuser. I think that's totally different. That's nothing like a national school board. And furthermore, we all voted in favor of the substance of these background check requirements when we all passed the Child Care Development Block Grant Bill, which, by the way, passed this chamber with one dissenting vote. I think it was 98-1. There was one no vote, which had nothing to do with the background check provisions, by the way. And the senior senator from Tennessee was an original co-sponsor of that legislation. And by the way, that also passed the House unanimously. And it's virtually identical. It holds that for children in these daycare centers should have the protection that comes with knowing that the employees have gone through this background check system. So do we have a national daycare board? I don't think so. And if it's okay to protect the youngest of kids, which it certainly is and should be, why can't we also extend that protection to kids who just get a little bit older? We're insisting on a standard that's appropriate and rigorous for kids who are toddlers. And then when they go to kindergarten, we're not going to have the same standard to protect them? That makes no sense to me at all. And then another point that I would make regarding this idea of a national school board, it's, look, this practice of passing the trash when a school district sends a letter of recommendation for a known offender and he takes that letter with him and goes across state lines, what can a single state do about that? The case I described of Jeremy Bell, the little boy who was killed by the teacher in West Virginia who originated in Pennsylvania. What could West Virginia do to forbid Pennsylvanians from sending a letter of recommendation for that teacher? Absolutely nothing is the answer, because West Virginia's legislative authority does not reach into Pennsylvania. This happens across state lines. In fact, it's a very conscious decision on the part of many of these predators because they want to put as much distance between their criminal activities as they can. When they move far sometimes. So this demands a federal response. There is nothing a state can do to solve this problem. And that's why we address it in our bill. And the other point I would make is, look, this isn't the first time that we've had the federal government establish some employment standards. We have federal laws that, for instance, ban discrimination in schools. Schools are not permitted under federal law. You cannot discriminate in your hiring on the basis of sex or race or age or religion or pregnancy. Does that mean we have a national school board? Does this mean we have to repeal all these laws? I don't think so. I think it's perfectly reasonable to have employment standards. And finally, Madam President, I would say, don't we have some responsibility of oversight of how federal tax dollars get spent by the states? I mean, do we send the money and say, hey, just here's a pile of cash, do whatever you like with it? I don't think that's a very reasonable standard. And what could be more reasonable than simply saying, you can't use federal tax dollars that we are responsible for if you're going to use it to pay the salaries of convicted child abusers? I think that's pretty straightforward. Now, I will say there may be alternative amendments here, right? There's been some discussion that some of our colleagues may offer alternatives to the legislation that Senator Manchin and I have. And I'm still willing to work with anyone on our side or the other side of the aisle if we can constructively work. If the goal is to actually get something passed that is going to be helpful, that's going to be constructive, then I'll work with anybody to get there. But there's a few things I won't agree to. I won't agree to a provision that under the guise of privacy requires a school to stay silent while a known child molester seeks a new teaching job. That's not reasonable. And I won't agree to a bill that does nothing to change the status quo, a bill that does nothing to provide additional protections for our kids. And unfortunately, in my view, the amendment that's offered by the senior senator from Tennessee fits into this latter category. He's got an amendment that I think provides absolutely no additional protections. It says that all states have to have a background check system. But guess what? All states already do. The problem is many of them are inadequate. And as I said before, there's nothing a state can do about passing the trash across state lines. So it does nothing to stop passing the trash. It does nothing to stop schools from hiring a convicted child rapist. They wouldn't. It doesn't say anything about the standards of the background check. The bill is so loose that if a state simply decided to do a Google search, that would meet the criteria of the bill. It's completely unacceptable. It does not change the status quo. It does nothing to protect the kids. And you could make the argument that not only that this bill is arguably worse than doing nothing because it could undermine the effort to do this right, create the illusion of having done something at the federal level when in fact it has not done so. So, Madam President, I will conclude by simply saying I'm not prepared to settle for the status quo. I am not satisfied when we have a situation where 459 school employees are arrested in a single year, arrested for sexual misconduct with the kids they're supposed to be taking care of. Obviously, we have a problem here. And I'm not going to settle for a pretend piece of legislation that accomplishes nothing, you know? And what comes home to me is my own 3 kids. I have 3 young children. And when one of my children gets on a school bus in the morning, I have every right to expect that the school that child is going to, the school my child is going to, is as safe an environment for him or her as it can possibly be. And every other parent in Pennsylvania and every parent in America deserves to have that peace of mind. And every child deserves to have that security. So that's why I'm not going to give up on this, Madam President. I'm confident at some point our Democratic friends are going to realize that it's a huge mistake for them to continue their filibuster of the trafficking bill. And when they do, they'll agree to let us proceed to it. And when that happens, I'll be back. Senator Manchin and I will offer our legislation as an amendment. We're going to have a debate about it. We're going to have a vote about it. I certainly hope that we win this vote. This, again, is legislation that passed the House unanimously. If it passes the Senate, it is sure to become law. And if it doesn't pass for some reason, then I'm going to come back again and again until we do. So, Madam President, I hope we'll take this up sooner rather than later. I hope we'll get on this bill still this week because there is still time. And I know we'll have an open amendment process when we do, and I look forward to offering this amendment. I note the absence of a quorum.